collection goes, I started collecting in 1959 beer labels for the simple fact that my parents must have had some bottles of beer there and that, and the labels looked interesting, so I soaked them off and just started putting a few away and progressed from there to writing to breweries overseas, asking for labels, etc., which everybody I wrote to, in actual fact, sent back labels and nice little letters and whatnot. So I ended up with a collection of 700 beer labels.
Wow.
And then when beer cans came, or when I probably got into the era of beer cans, they quite fascinated me, so I started just putting beer cans aside, of which the shelf in the garage at the moment, there's 280 different world, but I've also got about 180 New Zealand ones in another collection, and just the fascination of all the different labels.
Andrew's got a question here.
How many, Philip? How many of the contents of those beer cans would you have partaken in, if you had to estimate all of them?
280, I would say I probably had maybe about a quarter.
Is that all? That all? I'm surprised.
Now, what's going to happen to the collection? These beer cans, you want to donate them to a museum or another collection? What's happening?
I don't think they're like to the museum stage, but they are up for sale if someone would like them for their games room, or if they're setting up a bar.
100%.
Which is, yeah,
Paula, you got a studio?
I'm not setting up a bar. That's very sweet, but it makes me feel stressed at the idea of having that much stuff around, though, Philip. Why do you want to get rid of it?
We're downsizing, and I'm picking, wherever we go, a smaller garage is not going to have room for all the shelves of cans and other bits and pieces. Also collect model railway.
Goodness.
And have an N-gauge layout set, which takes up one half of our garage. And
there's not going to be room for everything, is there? Do you feel a little bit of a sadness, though, about the fact that you're letting the stuff go? After all that work to acquire it? Well,
it's been a great talking point for everybody coming round, and we did have once a pool table in the garage as well, and that was nice when the boys were younger. And
is there a favourite can? Is there a favourite can, Philip?
Well, I like the Carlsberg range, and also like the Carlsberg beer.
There you go.
There you go.
Well, there's got to be some bar in Auckland who setting up new in Auckland that would love to have your swanky collection. I'm sure some bar there would put them on the wall.
Keep collecting,
put
Philip.
Them on the wall, yeah.
Keep. It's lovely to have you on the program. Thank you very much for being with us. Anybody who wants a 280 beer can collection?
Put one on this train.
Yes.
On this train to go round, put them on this train.
Could be in your...
Could be in my house.
Pool room, Andrew.
Wow.
All right, Paula Penfold, Andrew Clay, thank you very much for being with us on
Always
Friday.
a pleasure, Wallace.
And thank you to Amelia Lang for putting the show together. I'm Wallace Chapman. See you at 3:45 Monday. Till then, bye.
At court.
Te whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. E haere nei, a call for unlimited sick leave for workers at airports and isolation and quarantine facilities to help keep COVID at bay. So how likely is it the virus could slip through our border into the community? An abused woman gets home detention for killing her violent partner. The public housing waitlist has officially tripled since the government took office. We talk to businesses about what happens when the second wave of wage subsidies runs out in a few weeks' time. And so why are restaurants and bars scrambling for workers when so many people are out of jobs? And the captain of the ship that brought the dangerous chemicals to Beirut almost 7 years before the catastrophic explosion.
RNZ News at 5 o'clock. Good afternoon, I'm Paul Brennan. The family of a man whose partner was today sentenced for his manslaughter says they're upset that he's been portrayed as the villain. Karen Ann Riddell was today sentenced in the Auckland High Court to 11 and a half months of home detention for Joseph Ngapera's manslaughter. During her trial, the court heard about the pair's abusive relationship, which his sister Ngaire Ngapera said was hard to hear.
Listening at court made it sound like our brother was the defendant and she was the victim. Yet we buried the victim, Joey. She stabbed him twice. Not once, but twice. She lunged at him both times. She pulled the knife out after the first stab and then stabbed him again.
Joseph Ngapera's sister Ngaire. One of Auckland's busiest rail choke points will have a third parallel line built to ease congestion. The busy industrial freight and passenger area from Middlemore to Whitty will have a third line built over 3.6 kilometres to allow more freight and commuter trains. It's a $315 million job, today announced by Kiwi Rail Chief Executive Greg Miller and the government. Greg Miller says this has been needed for decades and it's like adding another lane of motorway.
We can have a slow freight train arriving in the city being passed by commuter trains at speed. At the moment, we can't do that. We have to park the freight train and the commuter trains have to get past. That's something that happens in a 2-rail corridor network. 3 rail corridors changes that.
Greg Miller says they're also allocating property for the eventual build of a fourth line. Live reporting from the sentencing of the Christchurch Mosque's gunman has been banned. Brenton Tarrant will be sentenced on 51 counts of murder, 40 of attempted murder and 1 charge of under the Terrorism Suppression Act, beginning on Monday, August 24th. Timothy Brown has more.
There are fears the convicted terrorist may attempt to use his sentencing as a platform for his twisted worldview. Justice Cameron Mander has banned live reporting from the hearing. News of the sentencing will be embargoed until the midday and end-of-day adjournments, with possible suppressions on a session-by-session basis. 11 local news organisations and another 18 from overseas have signalled their intent to report on it. Overseas media can view the hearing digitally, but cannot copy or capture the stream. Ko Timothy Brown TNA.
The Bar Association says criticism of a South Island judge's sentencing of a sex offender is misinformed and dangerous. Earlier this week, the Sensible Sentencing Trust identified a female judge it claimed handed down what it called a pathetic sentence for child sex offending. The association says while public discussion around sentencing is a good thing, it's harmful when based on factually inaccurate information. It says some of the details circulating are outright wrong or misleading and are being spread by politically motivated lobby groups. The Bar Association says it feels a duty to highlight the misinformation as judges don't, by nature, enter into public debate. President Trump has signed an executive order to address what he calls the threat posed by the Chinese-based app TikTok. A ban on transactions with its parent company ByteDance comes into force in 45 days. The president says he's protecting American national security. Here's the BBC's David Willis.
The executive orders maintain that TikTok and WeChat constitute a threat both to the economy and the national security of the United States and accuse the owners of collecting personal information which could be used either for corporate espionage or blackmail purposes or to track the location of US government workers or contractors. The US computer giant Microsoft has expressed interest in acquiring TikTok's business here, and Microsoft now has 45 days in which to complete the purchase.
David Willis reporting there. It's 4 minutes past 5. On to sport now. The Southern Steel finally get to return home tonight when they host the Northern Mystics in Invercargill in netball's ANZ Premiership. After 2 months of charter flights back and forth from Auckland, this will be the Steel's first match in Invercargill this season. While the Steel may have had just 3 wins from their 12 games, they haven't lost a Premiership game in Invercargill since the competition's inception in 2017, and they've already beaten the Mystics this season. The third-place Mystics, though, are full of confidence after inflicting the first loss of the season on competition leaders, the Central Pulse, last round, and a win tonight will further enhance their bid for a grand finals berth. Pole vaulter Eliza McCartney is refusing to contemplate whether or not the 2021 Tokyo Olympics will go ahead or even whether she will be there. McCartney's battling ongoing Achilles issues and is currently having some downtime after an intensive training period. It's a problem the 23-year-old knows she'll have to manage for the rest of her career, but her immediate aim is to simply meet the qualifying height for the Games sometime over summer.
I'm just focusing on our season really at the moment, and that's the way I always approach it. It's about achieving the first thing first, and the first thing is to start competing in the summer and qualify. And that's all really that weighs on my mind, and until that's done, I won't focus on much else beyond that.
Eliza McCartney. And New Zealand golfer Lydia Ko was in vintage form as she grabbed a share of the lead after the opening round of the latest LPGA tournament in Ohio, carding a 7-under par 64. That's the news.
Tomorrow morning, Indian yellow, indigo blue, rose madder. Master paint maker David Coles on the history of colour. Tim Saunders has written about what he knows, this farming life, and how Dixon Chibanda's idea of friendship benches has taken off beyond his native Zimbabwe. Join me, Kim Hill, tomorrow morning from 8 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service through to midnight tomorrow Saturday. The northern half of the North Island, that's Taranaki and Taupō northwards, including Bay of Plenty. Showers, some heavy, possible thunderstorms and hail, clearing from tomorrow afternoon. Whanganui to Kapiti, including Taihape. Occasional showers, clearing tomorrow. Gisborne, Hawke's Bay, Waitangi and Wellington, a few showers and long fine spells today. Showers more frequent for a time tomorrow. Nelson, Buller, Westland and Fiordland. Scattered showers clearing this evening, mainly fine tomorrow, but a few showers about Western Nelson. Buller and southern Fiordland and Marlborough, mainly fine, but showers about the coast and Kaikoura ranges tomorrow morning. Canterbury, Otago and Southland. Scattered rain spreading from the south today and overnight, clearing up tomorrow, but a few showers persisting in the south. Chatham Islands, showers turning to rain for a time tomorrow morning. Nearly 7 minutes past 5.
Thanks, Paul. Kia ora and welcome to Checkpoint. I'm Lisa Owen. Tonight, a ballooning wait list for public housing with 10,000 people stuck in motels over the past 3 months. And what happens when businesses wave goodbye to the second wave of the wage subsidy? But first, workers on the front line of New Zealand's border, airport and isolation and quarantine facilities should get unlimited sick leave to help keep COVID out of the community, according to a university professor who studies the spread of the virus. Sean Hendy is one of the authors of a paper looking at how to minimise the risk of coronavirus getting through our border. And he considers those frontline workers one of the biggest risks when it comes to another outbreak. He's calling for a once-a-week COVID tests for all border and isolation workers. I asked Professor Hendy just how exposed we are on the front line.
If we kept the current quarantine going, then actually we could maybe have one case in 18 months that made it through the border that way. So what are the other things that we could look at? And so obviously now you start to think about, people who are working at the border, who are coming and going. They might spend time at the facility, a security guard, and then they're going back into society. And so it's a small risk, but it's a significant one. And of course we know, or at least we think that's what happened in Melbourne and Victoria. Maybe just one or two interactions between workers and infected people who were isolated that led to the big outbreak. So it's kind of one of those things that it's a relatively low risk, but it remains for us, and it can very quickly spiral out of control, as we've seen across the Tasman.
Okay, so let's talk about how we minimise that risk. In your view, given your modelling, what is the ideal testing regime?
Yeah, so we think a weekly test is the best way to do it. I mean, they're not pleasant things, the tests, and you don't want to discourage people from taking them by giving them too many tests. So we think a weekly test that actually greatly reduces the risk, followed by some symptom tests, right? So checking in with workers maybe every day. What have you got a cold? Have you got any of the classic symptoms of COVID? And if so, then a follow-up test, and not allowing, and isolating that person at home. And so with that actually greatly reduces the risk of that case coming outside. It's reduces things by about 90%.
90% it reduces the risk if you test those workers once a week.
Yeah, and have symptom checks, and that's relative to no testing and just worker awareness. We assume that people who are working in these facilities are being briefed and are being told to look out for symptoms, so they'll probably be more aware than most of us of what to look out for. So it's relative to just that general awareness.
So you mentioned earlier that potentially you could get one case every 18 months in terms of coming through the border. Was that just a random number you used then, or have you got some kind of modelling that suggests that would be the case?
I've been doing modelling of how well that quarantine period works and how well the testing works. Problem with the tests is that they don't always show up. There are some people, it might take 2 or 3 tests before they show positive. Some people, maybe never show up as positive. So the test is not perfect. So it's about reducing risk with tests rather than relying on tests to be perfect. And of course, there's the odd case where you can be infectious over more than the quarantine period. 99% of people will have passed through the course of the disease, of their infectiousness during that 2-week period, but there's still a tiny risk that could get through. And given the volume of people that are coming through, that translates into about 1 case coming through into the community every 18 months.
Okay. So in terms of your modelling, what is the possible scenario of spread if you get one frontline worker at the border who is positive?
Yeah, so the thing that we're really worried about, if we find if a worker returns a positive test, that's actually, that's a good outcome in some ways, because we've caught it in that individual before they've gone on to spread it perhaps to their household contacts. And the risk is, of course, that we don't detect it in the individual, either because the test gives us a false negative or because we're not testing frequently enough. And then it gets passed on through the household contacts. So, people who live with frontline workers need to be aware of that possibility. Or it could come out into the community. It could be a casual contact, a contact in a restaurant or a bar or on a bus, or an environmental contact where you've picked it up off, the virus up off a surface. And so in that case, that's what really concerns us, because once you find, if you find it in the environment, if you find it in a casual contact, that means maybe there's 10 to 15 other people who've been infected in that period.
Again, that 10 to 15 number that you use is from your modelling. If we pick it up at the point where a community contact of the infected border person has it, there's likely to be 10 to 15 other people who have it too.
That's right. That would be the average size of the outbreak at that period if we see it in someone who's not at the border.
So in this document, you talk about the thin line of defence at our border. In your view, currently, with the checks and balances in place, how thin is that line of defence?
I think we've got to remember we're in this for the long haul at the moment. We're looking at a plan that we have to keep in place for maybe a year to 18 months until we see a vaccine on the horizon. So it's something that we've got to maintain for a long time. It's got to be sustainable, and that's going to be a hard thing to do. I think it's worth resourcing well. It's worth us paying attention to, and it's worth us working continually to improve it and get it right.
So at the moment, as I understand it, they do health checks with the workers. Are you feeling well today? Do you have any cold symptoms? All of that kind of stuff. And also what I would, in lay people's terms, could call random testing. So have they given you any commitment to go to once a week testing for all of those workers on the front line?
We haven't had a commitment on that yet, but it's being considered at the moment, I believe.
How well do you think the government appreciates the vulnerabilities that you've pointed out at the border?
I think these are well understood. They're juggling things like the logistics around doing this, and there is some concern again about the fact that if you are a border worker, maybe you've used up your sick leave. You might just not mention the symptoms. If you realise there's a risk that you'll perhaps be sent home, or some of your family members might have to not go to work for a couple of weeks. So I think that we've got to take that into account. We've got to look at making sure we're supporting people, supporting these families that are working at the border. They're doing an important job for us, and we should be looking after them.
So, Sean, does that mean, in terms of looking after them, if you're in a frontline job at the border, should you get more sick leave then?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, definitely. And even if you're living in the household of a frontline worker, I think you should be given extra consideration and some financial support for quarantining.
And what would you think would be reasonable for sick leave then?
Look, you've got to. Every time, I would say this is not something you can put a quantum on, right? This is possibly something that people are going to have to do several times over the course of working in a frontline role. So there shouldn't be limits on it. If your workplace requires you not to be there because you're exhibiting symptoms, then you should not be there.
So in that sense, you're suggesting unlimited sick leave because that is part of the cost of protecting the country.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Hey, Sean, just curious, would you be comfortable working at the border?
I think I would. I'm someone who's been looking at this disease, and I'm sort of relatively well informed about the ways that you can protect yourself. And I just like everybody, border workers in particular, to be aware of those things. And so it is important for us to talk about this and raise awareness of the risks.
And that is Professor Hendy. He says he's been talking to the government and will speak to them again next week about his recommendations. And as you heard there, he's suggesting that those frontline workers be tested at least once a week to reduce the risks of COVID getting into the community. Now, we asked the Ministry of Health about that. It says it prioritises testing for those working at the border, including workers at managed isolation and quarantine facilities. There is a program of daily health checks, and any staff member who reports symptoms consistent with COVID-19 must stay at home, get tested and self-isolate until they receive the result of their test. The Ministry is also undertaking regular asymptomatic surveillance testing of people working in border-facing roles, including those at managed isolation and quarantine facilities, particularly those who have direct contact with international crew and travellers. And they say there is testing available on site for staff every 2 to 3 weeks. Now, the Ministry says it will continue to review how often the tests are needed. Nearly 14,000 more people have taken up the wage subsidy last week, and more than 466,000 jobs are still being supported by the government's scheme. The scheme will come to an end in just under a month's time, and businesses are worried about what that will mean for them. And as Nick Trubridge reports, debate is picking up on what more the government should do for those still struggling with the economic fallout of the pandemic.
Summer is peak season for Sam Sutton's Rotorua rafting business. So when the wage subsidy he's been using to pay his staff runs out, he's hoping to stay afloat through until those critical months.
It is quite scary, and you're kind of hoping that the light at the end of the tunnel is going to come reasonably quickly, come November or December. So it's just trying to bridge that gap to there, but it will be March next year, I think, when you realise, holy smokes, we didn't manage to stack anything away.
New figures show 466,412 jobs are being funded by the government's wage subsidy extension as of July 31. That's an increase of 13,987 jobs from a week earlier on July 24. That increase is down on previous weeks, but for Infometrics senior economist Brad Olson, the number of workers reliant on government help is confronting.
Of course, it does still mean that there's nearly 500,000 Kiwi workers who are in a very, very tough spot. Their businesses are not doing quite as well.
The government is due to turn the subsidy tap off in less than a month on the 1st of September. And that should be it, Olson says. He thinks it's time for the country to wean itself off broad government support.
And so a further wide-ranging extension to the wage subsidy would, in my mind, be the wrong move.
He says any targeted support should be reserved for businesses that actually have a future.
We don't want to just support firms to keep holding on and doing what they've always done. We need to support them to reimagine their business and transition to a different form of operations. Otherwise, New Zealand could be destined to be stuck with a number of businesses who are not viable, but we keep propping them up.
Business leaders spoken to by Checkpoint say the tourism industry is an obvious recipient for targeted support. In a statement, Finance Minister Grant Robertson says the government is focused on that sector, pointing to grants of up to $500,000 for 126 operators announced last weekend. However, tourism industry Aotearoa has labelled that package underwhelming. Back in Rotorua, Sam Sutton says he and his counterparts have already started looking for their own alternative streams of revenue.
I was talking to a couple of people recently, and they've got some pretty high targets to make, and if they're unable to make these targets, then their company's going to fold. So that's pretty black and white, I'd say. So yeah, I think everybody is anxious. I think that there's a lot of people planning, but you're planning for the unknown, and nobody knows when this is going to finish.
Business NZ Chief Executive Kirk Hope says his organisation is in talks with government about targeted relief, with the tourism sector an obvious candidate.
If we're anticipating wanting to have or anticipating having some form of international tourism sector, a sector that can service the international tourism market, we can't just cut it adrift. There will need to be support to maintain some of that infrastructure, those people and skills and capabilities. Otherwise, when tourists choose to come back here, what will they come back to?
However, Olsen has some reservations about getting too hung up on supporting tourism operators.
We can't just subsidise their operations when we have no clear end goal in sight for when we might change our border settings and let people back in. So I guess what I'm saying there is that to support the tourism sector, we need to allow them to actually re-engage in operations to find a new way to do business rather than to just prop them up to let them continue waiting for the borders to reopen. That second option doesn't give us a path to growth. All it does is pushes out the goalposts further and further.
Robertson is lauding the wage subsidy scheme as immensely successful, saying it cushioned the blow for more than 1.6 million workers with more than $13 billion paid out. He says the government is considering further help for businesses and workers still affected by the economic impact of COVID-19 after the subsidy. For Checkpoint, Nick Trubridge.
It is almost 22 minutes past 5 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. We would love your feedback on that. If your job's been supported by the wage subsidy or your business using it, what are you going to do when it runs out shortly? Are you going to be able to sustain all the positions that you have? We'd love to hear from you. Also, what do you make of this idea of unlimited sick leave for people working at our borders? So that's aviation security, customs, bus drivers who are taking returning travellers to and from isolation hotels, and everybody who works at those hotels. The suggestion is they should have unlimited sick leave to, lower the risk of COVID getting into the community. Let us know your thoughts on all of those things. You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Nearly 10,000 New Zealanders have had to live in motels over the past 3 months, with the public housing wait list up 50% on the same time last year. Latest figures through to the end of June show 18,500 people are now on the wait list, which means it's tripled since the government came to power in 2017. And as Nita Blake-Person reports, community housing providers say it could get worse.
When it comes to public housing in Gisborne, Robin Smith says the situation is a disaster.
There is nothing. There is nothing.
She's the Emergency Housing Service Manager for Te Whare Tūwhānau, Gisborne Women's Refuge. The latest quarterly public housing report paints a bleak picture for the whole country, but in Gisborne particularly, where there's been a nearly 90% increase in its waitlist over the past 12 months. And here's what that means for people who are waiting.
Okay, so a whānau of 2 adults, 4 children in a 1-bedroom unit. The stresses have been between the couple, just arguing, just health and mental health and well-being, and just the children not being able to, I guess, just live life, experience what's out there.
The demand for public housing is huge, with 18,500 people on the list for a spot. The wait list is longer than it's ever been, up 14% on 3 months ago and 50% on the same time last year. There were 6,100 people on the list in December 2017, shortly after the coalition government came to power. The Minister in charge of public housing, Chris Farfoy, rejects any notion that failed people in need of affordable accommodation.
No, I would push back on that furiously, because I think what we're seeing is people coming forward and saying they do need help. You know, if you look at the last 3 years, I think the waiting list obviously has grown, but we're also making sure that we're increasing supply. Certainly the difference that I have felt as a local MP and a minister in this government is that people feel like they can go on the waiting list because something will happen. They will eventually get a property, which is markedly different to 3 years ago.
The figures also show the government is placing fewer people in public housing and it's taking longer to do so. The number of applicants housed was down 36% to 1,115 in the 3 months to June. The average time it took to house them was 237 days, 20 days longer than last quarter. 9,600 people have had emergency housing grants to stay in motels while they wait for that housing, worth nearly $80 million. That's up from $54 million in the 3 months to March. Chris Farfoy says the government is building more public housing, but motels will be needed for some time yet.
It's obviously not ideal for people to be either in emergency housing or transitional housing in motels, but certainly pre- and post-COVID, making sure people have got a roof over their head is what we've tried to make sure is there for them. Again, I think we've committed to over 8,000 homes, 8,000 more additional homes over the next 4 or 5 years. So it will take some time to get people into that, but I think the priority for the government has been a motel is better than living in the back of a car.
Salvation Army analyst and lawyer Ronji Tanielu says the latest figures aren't surprising and he's expecting things to get worse before they get better.
It's a terrible strategy to have, to be honest, but it's a strategy that has to be used because there's very few places to actually send our whānau to. And so, look, we appreciate what government did in terms of trying to get people housed during level 4 and 3, but the challenge now is to get long-term sustainable housing for these whānau outside of the hotels. And look, it's a strategy that works for a little bit and has a bunch of holes in it, but we really need whānau in long-term, sustainable, warm, affordable, safe housing.
He says the government has made some big promises around public housing, but can do a lot better.
Our challenge, I guess, back to government and whoever this incoming government is that no one's really figured out this housing question. And so the answer is pretty straightforward. We need more houses. And so Kiwi Build was a little bit of a disaster. There's been a bunch of promises now, and so we as an organisation are just going to sit and wait and see what happens with this election and the promises that come out of it. But it's not just about promises, we need action.
Action, he says, can't come soon enough for the thousands of families waiting for a place to call home. Mō te hōtaka o te ahiahi nei, ko Nita Blake Person, aho.
A woman has been sentenced to 11.5 months home detention for the manslaughter of her partner. A High Court judge ruled the years of domestic violence Karen Ann Riddell faced and her desire to protect her child led to her offending. She stabbed her partner, Joseph Ngāpera, twice in the chest in November 2018. Earlier this year, a jury found her guilty of manslaughter, not murder. Matthew Tunison was in court.
In a raw and emotional sentencing in Auckland's High Court, Riddell spoke directly to Mr. Ngāpera's whānau.
I cannot take back what I have done, and again I am sorry. I have divided your family by taking from you a beloved son, a father, a brother, an uncle, a cousin and a grandfather.
Mr. Ngāpera's sister-in-law, Pride Ngāpera, told the court she wasn't ready to forgive Riddell.
No one deserves to die in the horrendous way that Joey was subject to. As we were slowly coming to terms with losing Joey, less than 5 months after Joey's death, we lost another brother in April 2019.
And just when we thought things couldn't get any worse, we lost Joey's firstborn son in September 2019.
His sister Nairi described how upsetting it had been to hear her brother maligned during the trial.
Listening at court made it sound like our brother was the defendant and she was the victim. Yet we buried the victim, Joey. She stabbed him twice. Not once, but twice. She lunged at him both times. She pulled the knife out after the first stab and then stabbed him again.
Riddell and Mr. Ngāpera had been at a Manurewa bar and continued drinking when they got home. They started arguing and she became fearful, calling to her grown-up son for help. But it was her 14-year-old boy who came out and confronted Mr. Ngāpera. Riddell said it was out of fear for her son that she picked up a knife and fatally stabbed her partner twice in the chest. Justice Palmer accepted that Riddell could reasonably have expected Mr. Ngāpera to harm them, given his violent past. He said Riddell had experienced a lifetime of harm, being exposed to violence and alcohol from a young age, and having relationships with numerous violent men.
Ms. Riddell repeatedly sought help against violence in her life, but that had led to a short-term response at best and removal of her children at worst.
There are records of 80 family violence incidents involving Riddell. Justice Palmer was critical of the Department of Corrections for initially providing what he described as a once-over-lightly pre-sentence report recommending imprisonment, and also of the Crown for refusing to consider accepting a guilty plea to manslaughter.
If the Crown had been willing to explore a sentence indication to facilitate it, a guilty plea may well have been forthcoming. In retrospect, the time and public expense of the 2-week trial may have been saved.
Justice Palmer referred to a report prepared by domestic violence expert Professor Denise Wilson from AUT.
I agree that Professor Wilson's report portrays a compelling picture of the social and cultural disadvantage you have suffered, which many Māori have systemically suffered. Not only were your circumstances of social entrapment relevant to your culpability of your offending, but your exposure to the preconditions of that through a life of alcohol and violence was systemically mandated by the social dynamics of New Zealand society.
Justice Palmer said Mr. Ngāpera's death caused a world of hurt.
I do not see imprisonment achieving the purposes and principles of sentencing or balancing the harm done here. Irrespective of where you live, you will have to live the rest of your life with guilt and whakamā, that although you did not intend to do so, you killed the man you loved.
Justice Palmer's sentencing notes have been published as a decision of public interest. Mō te hōtaka o te ahiahi nei, ko Matthew Tunis and aho.
Coming up on Checkpoint on RNZ National, restaurants and bars say our closed borders mean it's a struggle to recruit staff. French President Emmanuel Macron visits Beirut and promises its government will be held to account for Tuesday's fatal explosion. And taking the wind out of the instruments, why New South Wales Health wants you to take your trombone, saxophone or French horn somewhere else. Now, I'd love your feedback on anything you've heard on the programme this evening, particularly this idea or proposal maybe for unlimited leave for people who are working at our border or in isolation facilities. Also, the wage subsidy. Should it be extended? What are your thoughts there? And the housing wait list. It's tripled under this government. Let us know your thoughts. Text us 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or you can send us an email, checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Time for the headlines now with Paul.
Thanks, Lisa. The family of a man whose partner was today sentenced for his manslaughter say they're upset that he's the one who's being portrayed as the villain. In the Auckland High Court today, Karen Riddell was given 11 and a half months home detention for stabbing and killing Joseph Ngāpera. New modelling suggests if someone who works at the border contracts COVID-19 and it isn't caught, they have the potential to pass it on to 10 to 15 others. Professor Sean Hendy, who conducted the research, says New Zealand's biggest risk of another outbreak lies with the frontline workers, not people escaping isolation. He told Checkpoint testing workers once a week, along with regular symptom checks, could reduce that risk by about 90%. Kiwi Rail's chief executive says the new rail line to help ease congestion at one of Auckland's busiest choke points has been needed for decades. Greg Miller today announced the $315 million job to build a third parallel line on the busy industrial freight and passenger area from Middlemore to Whitty to allow more freight and commuter trains. Media has been banned from reporting live from the sentencing of the Christchurch Mosque's gunman. Brenton Tarrant's sentencing begins on Monday, August the 24th. There are fears the convicted terrorist may attempt to use it as a platform for his twisted worldview. The Bar Association says criticism of a South Island judge's sentencing of a sex offender is misinformed and dangerous. Earlier this week, the Sensible Sentencing Trust identified a female judge it claimed handed down what it called a pathetic sentence for child sex offending. It says some of the details circulating are outright wrong or misleading. And Oranga Tamariki's chief social worker has told the Waitangi Tribunal he understands from his own personal experience why involving whānau is crucial. Grant Bennett struggled to hold back tears as he acknowledged the ministry had failed at times to involve family in decision-making. Those are the headlines.
Thanks, Paul. Kia ora anō. This is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. It's time for the business news now with Nicholas Poynton. Nicholas, I like to call this the Precious Metals Report. You've been giving us some figures on gold over the last little while. So now, well, the poor cousin, silver. What have you got for us?
Yeah, look, I honestly thought I would never have the privilege again to talk about precious metals on the show. But look, silver is on a relentless rise at the moment. It rose about 7% overnight, bringing it to $29 an ounce, which is, I think that's a 7-year high. And this caps off a huge week. It's up 22% for the week. And I should mention that since mid-March, when the global pandemic began to emerge and we saw governments locking down, central banks taking action, silver's price has increased 148%. So this is all pretty outrageous, but I should make it some conditional statements, and that is, silver is just a lot cheaper than gold, and that's why more people tend to buy it. And because of its low price position, you tend to see these kind of big shifts in its price because, if a lot of people rush out to buy it, the price is going to move. But I did have the pleasure of speaking to a precious metal merchant this morning, and he told me he was absolutely blown over by silver's rise. And he partly puts it down to a couple of things. He says, as we went into lockdown, or as countries started to go into lockdown in March, silver's price actually dipped. So from that, there was an expectation that it would rebound. The other thing is that, overseas suppliers, they're actually struggling to meet the demand. So that drives the price up even further. And on top of that, we've seen the US dollar actually begin to fall. And all these precious metals, they're measured, their price is pegged to the US dollar. So when we see the US dollar begin to fall, other currencies have more buying power. So I asked this merchant, I was kind of interested to hear what's going to happen going forward. And he was quite honest. He says the market is overdue for a correction. He says this relentless rise, it can't keep going on. It has to pull back at some point. It can't keep on going up. But his 5-year outlook, he gave me his 5-year outlook, what he expects in the future, and he reckons gold and silver, they're going to hit record levels.
I find this really perplexing, Nicholas, because it's kind of like Emperor's New Clothes. It's a block of gold. I mean, what's it good for? Who's buying it? It's like a bag of salt. It only has the value that someone will pay for it.
Well, that's the thing. A lot of people just have a lot of trust in these currencies. That's, we could get into why people trust currency at all. It is built on just a belief and an understanding. But look, when this merchant's talking about its 5 years outlook and he's expecting gold and silver to hit these record or never seen before levels, I asked him to sort of explain his reasoning, and I think what he reveals is so fascinating. He says that what they're noticing, and I quote here, that there is a distinct loss of faith in currency, there is a distinct loss of faith in government, and a growing distrust of people holding their money in banks. So if we look at this rise we've seen in these metals, it's actually indicative of maybe a wider feeling we're seeing in the world. And I think going forward, man, that is really interesting to keep an eye on. And that's the thing that really interests me about this subject.
Okay, maybe you can do a sidebar follow-up. What's it doing to the price of jewellery? You can keep us up to date with that next time.
That would be a good thing. That would be a good thing to follow, yeah.
Okay, so new data shows the country's largest electricity retailers are losing customers. Why? Where are they all going off to?
Yeah, this is some new quarterly data from the electricity Electricity Authority has put out, and it shows the smaller retailers in the market, that's your Novas, Electric Kiwi, Focus and Flick, they're snagging all these customers from the big players in the market, not stealing them, but they're taking them from Mercury, Genesis, Trustpower and Contact, and they've seen, those big players, they've seen a combined drop of 16,000 customers. And the advocacy group Consumer New Zealand, they say, look, they're really happy about the news. Not the fact that these big companies are losing customers, but the fact that there's significant competition in the market and people are doing their due diligence and they're going out there and they're hunting for deals. And when asked about what are the other things they're noticing in consumers' habits, one of the things they talked about was that, look, a lot of consumers are quite upset with the big companies because sometimes one of the things that's a real pain for consumers is that they find their customer service actually really poor. Consumer says that people are not happy about long waits on the phone, they're not happy receiving incorrect statements in the mail or via email, and sometimes people get pretty upset when it takes, days or multiple days to get a reply to quite a simple question. So, look, I guess if we sort of survey the whole sector, we can say, look, it's looking relatively healthy.
Yeah, if people are mobile, that means it's simple enough for them to do it. Let's talk about the numbers from the markets.
Yeah, so the NZX Top 50 is actually down 1% by 118 points, which is quite a drop. But this is in line with world stock markets tumbling around the world after Donald Trump ratcheted up and already heightened tensions with Beijing. So markets around the world didn't like that. The New Zealand dollar is down a third to 66.6 US cents, up at 92.5 Australian, and steady at 50.8 British pence. And gold, after all this talk, is actually down for the day at $2,058 US dollars an ounce. And silver has fallen a touch, but it's still at $28 US dollars an ounce.
Thanks, Nicholas. I look forward to next week's jewellery report. That's Nicholas Poynton with our business news. Oranga Tamariki's bosses have fronted up to the Waitangi Tribunal today to explain why Māori fare so badly in the state care system. The tribunal's urgent inquiry is underway in Wellington. It comes just a day after the Chief Ombudsman released a scathing report into the ministry, which found babies were routinely being removed from their whānau, rather than in exceptional cases only. Tianiwa Hurihanganui reports.
Oranga Tamariki's chief social worker, Grant Bennett, struggled to talk through his tears today as he appeared before the tribunal. He acknowledged some of the ministry's failures, in particular its lack of involvement with whānau in its decision-making, and says he understands from his own personal experience with the state why involving whānau is crucial.
I have a daughter. I'm fully responsible for her. I don't want the state caring for her. Sorry. Yeah, I want my brother to look after it. My daughter also has a serious illness that requires medication that I couldn't fund. But the state is there to support me to do that, to be a better parent. So that's how I see it working for everybody.
This is the fifth inquiry into Oranga Tamariki since it tried to take a newborn baby from a Hawke's Bay mother's hospital bed last year. The story grabbing headlines and bringing the ministry under intense scrutiny. Mr Bennett says it's made some changes since then, including cases requiring additional checks before a without notice application to remove a child can be signed off, and partnerships with iwi. But he says social workers' jobs are incredibly difficult, and sometimes the public only sees half the picture.
The thing that social workers see on a day and bit, babies with broken femurs, babies meth addicted, children with multiple fractures. So I've seen social workers criticised for not visiting families, but the social worker was scared of the father. I've seen social workers rationalise poor decisions. I've seen people lose perspective of what's serious and what's not. I've seen people lose compassion. I just want to acknowledge the environment that social workers are working in.
The Ombudsman's own investigation into Oranga Tamariki found decisions to remove babies under a without notice court order were often being made late without expert advice or whānau involvement. Social work lecturer Shane Walker, who also appeared before the tribunal as a Crown witness, says there are times Oranga Tamariki does not have the expertise or capacity to support whānau. He says multiple government agencies must be in the room when deciding whether to remove children from their parents.
The problems that Oranga Tamariki has is that it has the capacity to work with the individual rather than the broader disparity. Hence my list there of ministries, and those ministers need to be working with Māori in constructive ways to deal with those issues.
He says Oranga Tamariki is working hard to transform its practices.
They are attempting to move from assessment, surveillance, control and removal, and starting to see child protection in its capacities for real help and recovery. There are pockets of good practice, and I'm here today really because of the number of people I know in that organisation that sweat blood.
Oranga Tamariki's chief executive, Grania Moss, told the tribunal it's clear the ministry must continue to do better. But she says it's ultimately going to take support from other government agencies to ensure whānau do not need state intervention in the first place.
So actually just turning the tap off and not bringing them into care is not the answer, because we don't want to see more children dead, we don't want to see more children harmed. And what we want is our whānau and our hapu and our iwi and our communities living in a different way where they no longer need state care.
She says the ministry is open to any recommendations by the Waitangi Tribunal. Mo te hōtaka o te ahiahi, ko te aniwa, hurihanga nui, aho.
To Beirut now, where Lebanese authorities have arrested 16 people, including the port manager, as the investigation into Tuesday's fatal explosion, which displaced 250,000 people, continues. French President Emmanuel Macron made a dramatic visit to the site today, calling for calm and an international inquiry as angry protests took place throughout the city. Macron vowed whilst aid would be forthcoming, Lebanon's leaders would need to end rife corruption first, and he would be returning next month to follow up. Adam Reid reports.
Facing devastation, help is arriving in Lebanon. These emergency aid flights from Italy and Russia touching down in Beirut, carrying medical personnel and supplies, less than 2 days after a catastrophic explosion levelled the city's port area and destroyed large sections of the Lebanese capital. French President Emmanuel Macron also arrived Thursday, promising to help organise international efforts, whilst warning Lebanon's authorities that they need to address the corruption within.
The first victim of this crisis is the Lebanese people. It requires an extremely quick reaction. So for me, this visit is also an opportunity for frank dialogue, a demanding one with political leaders and Lebanese institutions.
The death toll reached at least 145 by Thursday, but dozens are still missing. Up to 250,000 people have been left without habitable homes. Preliminary investigations blame the explosion on inaction and negligence, saying nothing was done to remove tons of ammonium nitrate from the port. Local officials have denied the incident was the result of an attack. Lebanon's hospitals are overwhelmed by thousands of injured people, while other care facilities were themselves put out of action by the explosion. At St George Hospital, the ceiling caved in, killing 4 nurses. The people of Lebanon are used to suffering through decades of war and civil unrest. After this latest tragedy, among the personal and material loss, came a song. Beirut resident Hoda Melki captured a touching video of her mother playing the piano, surrounded by the debris of her damaged apartment.
Meanwhile, the 2,750 tonnes of ammonium nitrate, which caused the fatal explosion, first arrived on leaky Russian-registered cargo ship in Lebanon in September 2013. The captain of the Rosis, Boris Prokoshev, says the ship was transporting the chemicals from Georgia to an explosives manufacturer in Mozambique when they were asked by the ship's owner to stop in Beirut to pick up some roading equipment. Prokoshev says when the ship stopped, it became embroiled in a lengthy dispute over port fees, and he and 3 crew members spent 11 months on the ship without pay and limited food until the chemicals were seized, unloaded and put in a dock warehouse. He says he had no idea that almost 7 years later the chemicals were still at the warehouse.
Я вот это понять не могу.
I have no idea why the blast has happened, but I cannot understand the fact that the cargo has been stored there for such a long time. When we had been there for over 10 months, the owner did not claim the cargo. As far as I know, the cargo was unloaded in 2014 or in 2015, and no one claimed it. It was possible to register it as dangerous, as it was indeed dangerous, and to move it to some fields, to fertilise soil with, to plough it and to solve the problem. I have no idea why that was not done. Knowing that dangerous cargo is on board a ship in a Beirut port, and when the ship owner asked to go to Cyprus, the authorities should have paid him extra to remove the ship and take this headache away from the port. In this case, it was better if the ship would have sank along with the cargo. It should have been taken into the harbour to anchor it as the first option. The second option was, but it would have involved costs, to tow the cargo away to some other port and unload it there or to sell it.
Prokoshev says if he had known what cargo he was transporting at the time, he would have never got on board. Back home, the Taranaki Medical Officer of Health says New Zealand finds itself in the eye of a COVID-19 storm, and more testing is required to discover if there has been undetected transmission in the community. Dr. Jonathan Jarman says new cases of COVID-19 are arriving at our borders every other day, and we can't let our guard down. Our Taranaki Whanganui reporter Robin Martin has more.
So now you're just going to quickly head backwards and keep your eyes closed.
Pop-up COVID-19 testing stations were set up in central New Plymouth and at 2 locations in Palmerston North today as the Ministry of Health tries to ramp up testing numbers. About 10 minutes after the operation opened up in the New World supermarket car park in New Plymouth, more than 20 people were lining up for nasal swabs while a similar number queued in their cars. Dr. Jonathan Jarman says New Zealanders could not afford to rest on their laurels.
There is a little bit of complacency, I'm afraid. People have forgotten about COVID-19, but every time you pick up the newspaper and look at what's happening in other parts of the world, you can see how quickly things can go wrong.
Dr. Jarman says the fact there has not been a recorded case of community transmission for some time does not mean we are out of the woods.
There are cases coming to New Zealand virtually every day, and there is concern that there may be a little hidden pocket of community transmission somewhere that we don't know about. So to have that sort of reassurance, we need to do more community testing.
Dr. Jarman says the nation's borders were of particular concern and weekly testing will soon begin at Port Taranaki and community testing will be rolled out at smaller towns across the province. Operations Manager for Community Testing in Taranaki is Lydia Ray. She was rapt with the turnout in New Plymouth.
Really good. So an hour ago we had thunder and lightning and a torrential downpour. So as you can see, the sun's now come out and there's lots of people here in support of this today, which is fantastic to see.
Ms Ray says the testing team runs like a well-oiled machine.
So we've done quite a few of these pop-ups and we often are ready to respond to a mobile request at any stage. So I would say that this team's done many swabs now, and so we have a really good system in place, and so we're able to sort of make this happen at short notice when we need to.
Garth Guptill was waiting in the queue.
The reason I've come along is it's for everyone's safety at the end of the day. You know, we've got to look after us as well as everyone else.
Mr Guptill is worried about community transmission.
Well, with all these people coming back into the country, it's inevitable, unfortunately. That's my opinion anyway.
Vicky was feeling a bit under the weather.
Because I've just got a bit of a blocked nose and a slightly sore throat, which I've had for a couple of days, so it just feels like a head cold, but I thought it's probably best to be safe and not rather than sorry.
While Greg Stevens was walking the talk.
I think this is something we need to be doing nationally to see a lot more of it, so I can't be a hypocrite and refuse to do it myself. I've got relatives in both the UK and Melbourne, so I'm definitely seeing the international perspective.
RNZ caught up with Garth Guptill after his test.
How was that?
It's a sensation that I wouldn't want to do every 5 minutes, that's for sure.
Reckon it should put people off coming?
Not really, no, not for the overall result.
Probably get the results back by about Tuesday.
The Ministry of Health says there's been a strong response to the call for people to get tested. 4,014 COVID-19 tests were processed yesterday, bringing the total number of completed tests to 486,943. There were also 282 swabs taken in managed isolation and quarantine facilities yesterday. Pop-up testing stations will be in operation tomorrow at the South Mall car park in Manurewa and at Orchard Road near Christchurch Airport in Canterbury. I ngā mutu mo te hōtaka o te ahi pōnei, ko Robin Martinaho.
It is 7 minutes to 6. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. When it comes to tackling the pandemic, Italy has gone from a cautionary tale to virtually a how-to guide. It was the first European country to be hit badly by the virus, followed by a long and tough lockdown. But while it saved lives, the impact on businesses has been devastating, especially in tourism. The BBC's Mark Lowen reports from Tuscany.
As Chianti's grapes ripen, its tourism is turning sour. If only business at the Antinori vineyard looked as promising as this year's harvest. Visitors are trickling back, but few foreigners.
These big casks are quite typical of Chianti Classic.
The family has been making wine here since 1385. The 26th generation to run it says she's never seen it so bad.
The British market has always been very, very important in terms of tourism and in terms of work as well. The only replacement we've had was the Italian, so we lost like 90% of tourism in here. It's very big. We've never lived anything like this. In my generation, I've never lived anything like this. This is like a war. So it's like being after the war.
In nearby Florence, it's usually hard to move for August tour groups. No longer. The first Western country crushed by coronavirus is emerging scarred, with tourism, 13% of Italy's economy, expected to drop by half this year.
And that was Mark Lowen reporting. Could saxophones be spit-wielding COVID-spreading machines? New South Wales Health has advised musicians that wind instruments shouldn't be played near other people. It's the latest precaution as people adjust to the coronavirus pandemic. The ABC's Elene Soltis reports.
Vigorously blowing into a musical instrument can be a rather wet affair.
Hi, I'm Mark Walton and I'm a saxophone player and I'm a saxophone teacher and I teach the clarinet and play the clarinet as well.
Since the pandemic began, Mark Walton has taken even greater measures to keep his workplace spotless.
Things have changed. Because now, when I finish teaching in the studio, I sanitise every surface and I spray the room.
And there is a serious risk of COVID. New South Wales Health says while it's not aware of an outbreak associated with playing wind instruments, it's now advising that instruments like saxophones, clarinets and flutes have the potential to spread COVID-19. It's now saying these instruments shouldn't be played near other people in confined spaces.
Well, look, I'm just wondering whether someone in authority has got a neighbour who plays the saxophone and they're trying to find some way of regulating their playing. No, I'm being facetious. Look, I think we're all being very careful, but I think there is such incredible anomalies going on with all of this. You go on public transport and you see people huddled together. You see people ignoring the green signs on the seats and so on. You see people playing sport. So there are these huge differences that are happening.
Samantha, not her real name, is a saxophone and clarinet teacher. She says she can understand why health authorities would be concerned about woodwind instruments.
What happens on the clarinet is that the air goes through this cylindrical bore. It touches your fingertips if you're covering the holes. And if your fingers aren't covering the holes, that air, this is how I see it, is coming out through the holes on the clarinet. And then only for actually 2 notes on the clarinet does the air come out the bottom of the clarinet, which is where most people probably presume it comes out because it looks like the sort of horn end of the instrument, but it's actually coming out all onto your fingers. So I have students and they're playing their clarinets and then touching music stands, touching different surfaces and chairs. And in some of the places I'm working, there's no sort of infection control procedure in place. There's no hand sanitizer being provided.
Even now?
Even now, I mean, one of the schools I work at, I'm teaching at the top of a flight of stairs. They've got hand sanitizer where you enter the school at the reception, but there's no hand sanitizer in the corridor where I'm teaching. This is a private school where parents are paying a lot of money.
Overseas, the Vienna Philharmonic has also conducted experiments measuring the airflow of wind instruments, and it found a large amount of aerosol can escape from the flute, with a cloud formation spanning 75 centimetres. This was not a peer-reviewed study. For now in New South Wales, woodwind players are on notice, and those playing other instruments, including the French horn or trombone, should stay 1.5 metres away from each other and the audience.
Potentially the upside to that is no recorder for a wee while. A lot of you are getting in touch about Professor Sean Hendy's suggestion that people working at the border in an isolation and quarantine facilities should get unlimited leave. This person's sick leave, that is. This listener says, I'm 100% in favour of unlimited sick leave. The situation in Victoria has been exacerbated by people going to work because they cannot afford to lose the pay. Yes to unlimited sick leave, this person says, for those working at the borders. Maybe a compulsory doctor's certificate should be required to reassure employers that the leave is legit. The government should foot the bill for those doctor's visits too, says Helen. Also, Sean Hendy is saying they should be testing workers once a week, ideally. This person says that they're gobsmacked that there isn't regular testing of flight crews and others who are working at the border. Remember, the Ministry of Health says it is doing what it calls asymptomatic surveillance testing of frontline workers, and also tests workers at isolation facilities every 2 to 3 weeks, it says.
RNZ News at 6. Kia ora, good evening, I'm Paul Brennan. A judge has ruled that the systemic disadvantage suffered by Māori helped to create the conditions in which Karen Ann Riddell stabbed and killed her partner. Riddell was this morning sentenced to 11.5 months for the manslaughter of Joseph Ngapera in 2018. In Auckland's High Court, Justice Palmer acknowledged Riddell had been subjected to abuse her whole life.
Not only were your circumstances of social entrapment relevant to your culpability of your offending, but your exposure to the preconditions of that through a life of alcohol and violence was systemically mandated by the social dynamics of New Zealand society.
Justice Palmer. Oranga Tamariki's chief social worker struggled to hold back tears as he told the Waitangi Tribunal the ministry needs to do better to support whānau Māori. The tribunal's urgent inquiry into Oranga Tamariki, which in part seeks to find out why Māori are disproportionately taken into state care, is underway in Wellington. Grant Bennett acknowledged the ministry had failed at times to involve family in decision-making. He says he understands from his own personal experience why involving whānau is crucial.
I have a daughter. I'm fully responsible for her. You know, I don't want the state caring for her. Sorry. My daughter also has a serious illness, requires medication that I couldn't fund. But the state is there to support me to do that, to be a better parent. So that's how I see it working for everybody.
Chief Social Worker Grant Bennett. New modelling shows it's not isolation escapees who pose the biggest risk of COVID-19 getting back into the community. It's the frontline border workers. The research from Professor Sean Hendy suggests the spread is most likely to come from someone working near the border or isolation facilities who then takes it back to their families. He told Checkpoint it's a small risk, but a significant one, and through better testing it could be reduced. Sean Hendy says if the virus gets to a household, it could then spread through 10 to 15 people. Security forces in Lebanon have used tear gas to stop protesters who attempted to storm Parliament. The demonstrators have expressed anger over Tuesday's massive explosion in Beirut, which they say the government could easily have avoided. At least 135 people were killed and 5,000 injured in the accidental chemical fire. Among some protesters, there is a growing unease that no one will be held accountable. Auckland Sky Tower will turn its lights off tonight to remember the victims of the blast. The Bar Association says circulating criticism of a South Island judge's sentencing of a sex offender is misinformed and dangerous. Earlier this week, the Sensible Sentencing Trust identified a female judge it claimed handed down a pathetic sentence for child sex offending. Annika Smith reports.
The Bar Association has raised its concerns about the criticism of the judge they say is being unfairly maligned. President Kate Davenport QC says while public discussion around sentencing is a good thing, it's harmful when based on factually inaccurate information. She says the most obvious example is that it's being referred to as a case of rape when it was not. Ms Davenport says some of the information circulating is wrong or misleading and is being spread by politically motivated lobby groups. Ko Annika Smith-Aho.
An environmental group has accused the government of betrayal by allowing mining on conservation land in South Coromandel. The Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment has granted the permit to Oceana Gold for its operations near Whangamata. Coromandel watchdog of Hauraki says it's a failure by the government to honour its promise there'd be no new mines on conservation land. Oceana Gold says the permit does not allow construction of a mine, but evaluation only. It says any application to develop a modern underground mine will involve extensive public input. 6:04. Now to sport. Chiefs coach Warren Gatland wants to keep coaching the winless side next year if the British and Irish Lions tour of South Africa is unable to go ahead due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Gatland's 4-year deal at the Chiefs gives him the second season off to coach the Lions. The Chiefs have just one more chance to notch a win in Super Rugby Aotearoa when they play the Hurricanes in their final game of the season this weekend. The Lions tour is scheduled for July and August next year, but South Africa is struggling to contain the pandemic. The Chiefs have lined up Clayton McMillan as head coach for next season. Gatland says he'd like to remain on board if the Lions tour is called off, but concedes he'd probably have to do it for free. The Warriors' 15-month quest for back-to-back National Rugby League victories resumes tonight when they play Manly. They enjoyed a surprise win over the West Tigers last round to give them 4 wins from 12 matches this season. The Auckland side sits 12th on the ladder, while Manly are 9th with 5 wins. And athletes testing positive for recreational drugs out of competition will be banned by the World Anti-Doping Authority for 1 to 3 months instead of 2 years when the policy is changed next year. WADA's reduced sanctions for drugs that do not enhance the performance of an athlete will come into effect from January the 1st, with a stronger focus on catching athletes who cheat instead. And that's the news.
Tonight on Nights, country life is harvesting olives with a bloke who gave up a life on the beehive for a life on the land. But can you really ever keep politics out of food production? One-time Australian Idol Stan Walker selects the mixtape, and because it's the 7th day of the month, we've got a Sonic Tonic dedicated to something a lot of us do on the 7th day of the week: rest. On Nights with me, Brian Crump, after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
And we're funded through New Zealand On Air. Now the short forecast from Med Service taking us to midnight tomorrow Saturday. The northern half of the North Island, that's Taranaki and Taupo northwards, including Bay of Plenty. Showers, some heavy, possible thunderstorms and hail, clearing tomorrow afternoon. Whanganui to Kapiti, including Taihape, occasional showers. They should clear up tomorrow. Gisborne, Hawke's Bay, Wairarapa and Wellington, a few showers, long fine spells today. Showers more frequent for a time tomorrow. Nelson, Buller, Westland and Fiordland, scattered showers clearing this evening, mainly fine tomorrow, but a few showers about Western, Nelson, Buller and southern Fiordland. Marlborough, mainly fine, but showers about the coast and Kaikoura ranges tomorrow morning. Canterbury, Otago and Southland, scattered rain spreading from the south for the rest of today and overnight, then clearing up tomorrow. A few showers persisting in the south. At the Chatham Islands, the showers turn to rain for a time tomorrow morning. It's nearly 6:07.
Thanks for that soggy outlook, Paul. Welcome back to Checkpoint. I'm Lisa Owen. Restaurants and bars around the country are scrambling for staff and say they can't fill even senior positions, with closed borders keeping both workers and clients away. But the Restaurant Association says now's the time for New Zealanders to stop looking down on hospitality and give it a go. And as Alex Perrottet and Nick Monroe report, economists are warning the government that wage subsidies cannot be a long-term solution.
Mandy Lush owns Vivace on Fort Street in Auckland's once busy downtown streets. She moved here from High Street to chase the tourist market, but it's gone. Gone too are many of the casual but once committed corporate clients who are now working from home. And throw into the mix the odd COVID-19 scare.
The day the first new person came in through the border and we got COVID, one positive case,
We lost 3 functions for that week. One of the saddest things is all the redundancy drinks that we're doing in our bar, firms cutting off. I think a certain amount of that is firms also taking an opportunity perhaps because they see things getting worse. Even if they're not hurting yet, they're certainly looking at downsizing their premises and staffing.
She's having to advertise 4 positions because her current chefs and kitchen hand have visa issues.
A sous chef, senior sous chef, a chef de partie, and a kitchen hand that we're looking for. We don't have a kitchen hand and we can't find one. The chefs, we've got people. We're struggling to work with immigration to be able to keep them, but they're all working up to about 70 hours a week to cover that poor girl who's just sitting there unable to work, waiting for a visa that should have been processed weeks ago.
We know that many Kiwis are out of jobs in similar industries, so why won't they migrate to hospitality?
It's incredibly frustrating when you see, I think we're portrayed quite badly in the media, as poorly paid, exploiting immigrants and things like that. You know, none of our staff are on the minimum wage and, you know, they get meals with every shift, even for a dishwasher. So even our kitchen hands would be on around a $50,000 salary working full time. But we've had not one single New Zealander apply for a kitchen hand role in several years.
But the Restaurant Association says that now is the best opportunity to lure Kiwis into these jobs, because even when the borders are back open, bars and restaurants don't necessarily want to keep relying on the intermittent working holiday staff. The association's CEO Marissa Bidwar says hospitality needs a PR boost.
We also need to look at how we're selling our industry for when we do eventually reopen our borders. When people come to visit New Zealand, they do want to be served by New Zealanders as well.
She says the industry has struggled long before the pandemic, but still 78% of its members can't fill positions, and many of them are for well-paid work.
Prior to COVID, we were experiencing a severe skill shortage in our industry. And now, as we're working through COVID times, that severity has come down slightly, but it's still there and certainly concentrated in the most senior positions.
In the short term, she says she's asking the government to extend the wage subsidy.
We are asking for another 6 weeks of wage subsidy, and we've had 2 lots of wage subsidy coming through now, and we think the time is right to be considering a third.
But economist Julian Wood, a researcher for the Maxim Institute, says the wage subsidy must have a limit.
You know, we've got this abrupt ending to the wage subsidy, and I think that's actually appropriate. You know, we don't want to lock people into the past. All the evidence from overseas basically says, you know, wage subsidies really can help at the front end of a recession. But if you continue with them, they can actually become a harmful thing because they slow down their person's ability to say, actually, I need to move into something new. I need to retrain. I need to look towards the future rather than the past.
He says hiring subsidies are the better way to go, paying employers to take on untrained staff and skill them up for a long-term position.
There's just a need to help people get over that initial shock of trying something new.
And there's also a political divide over the best solution. Labor says it's investing in free trades training and giving some money to cover apprenticeships, while National says it wants to pay employers an effective hiring subsidy, but that's only for the creation of new jobs. Mandy says neither's really going to help her. She wants people who can come in and immediately learn on the job, not new jobs, but the very current ones she's desperately trying to fill.
But if there was a subsidy there, you've got years of experience that we can train people on the job, and that would definitely be worth it. I think it's still so uncertain out there. I think people would struggle to think about expanding at the moment. We could certainly do with an apprentice in our bar area, but that is almost impossible to find. But no, as an industry, I think everyone's still too cautious because we just don't know what's going to happen.
For Mandy and so many other business owners, it's just a question of day-to-day survival. For Checkpoint, Alex Perrottet.
And if you were listening to that piece from Alex and Nick, we will put the video up online. It'll be on our Facebook page and you can check it out. A lot of you getting in touch about the wage subsidy. You would have heard some of those in the hospitality industry would like it extended for 6 more weeks. It's obviously had 2 runs of the wage subsidy at the moment, due to run out in the next few weeks. Paul says, the wage subsidy helped me through April and May, and I managed to retain all staff. I employed someone new this week. My industry, which is advertising, was not as badly hit as others. However, it was tough going. I don't feel extending the subsidy is a good idea, he says. It's been over 3 months since lockdown, and if your business still needs support, it's possibly not viable long term, says Paul. Another listener says the wage subsidy should not be extended. The cards need to be let to fall so we can then employ people in the right areas. Richard's got in touch and also says subsidised businesses need to have a future. Time to reinvent some businesses, put resources into that. And Richard also chucks in there that he says yes to unlimited sick leave for those keeping us safe at the borders. That is one of the things that Professor Sean Hendy, who models the spread of COVID, is recommending, unlimited sick leave for people working on the front line at the isolation hotels and also at our borders. It is almost 14 minutes after 6. You're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Work has started on a new railway line after a decades-long wait to free up one of Auckland's busiest choke points. The government-funded program was announced today. Building a third line between Whitty and Key Park near the CBD is a $315 million job, with the potential to support more than 400 jobs. KiwiRail Chief Executive Greg Miller says it's been needed for decades, comparing it to adding another lane of motorway.
We can have a slow freight train arriving in the city being passed by commuter trains at speed. At the moment, we can't do that. We have to park the freight train and the commuter trains have to get past. That's something that happens in a 2-rail corridor network. 3 rail corridors changes that.
Greg Miller says he's confident the job will be completed before the City Rail Link project in central Auckland. The third main line is one of 4 city rail projects worth more than $1 billion funded by the government's infrastructure upgrade program. Labour's transport spokesperson Phil Twyford says it will benefit the city and the climate.
$1 billion of investment into our rail network. That is one of the most important tools in our fight against the climate emergency. That is how we're going to move more freight with fewer carbon emissions. It's how we're going to get cars and trucks off the road and reduce carbon emissions and get us on the road to being net zero carbon emissions by 2050.
Other projects include electrification from Pukekohe to Papakura, new stations in the south and a large maintenance program around the city. Ngāti Kahungunu ki Wairoa descendants are overjoyed they can do up their wharenui while also attracting their rangatahi back to their marae, with over $1.5 million from the Provincial Growth Fund. The funding will support renovations on 19 marae across Wairoa. The Under-Secretary for Regional Economic Development, Fletcher Tabuto, unveiled today. Miriana Johnson has more.
Te tira mai ngā iwi.
It was a joyous day for Ngāti Kahungunu ki Wairoa descendants who say their marae are the backbone of their community. More than 65% of the 8,300 Wairoa locals are Māori. Despite the town's small population, there are 35 marae in the area. Today, 19 of those marae heard from Fletcher Tabuto that they would receive funding for landscaping, building repairs, electrical wiring, plumbing and painting work. He says this will create 133 jobs.
That's a good way to invest your taxpayer money to reinvigorate the communities, make sure there are jobs, make sure there's literally money moving through your community so that those technicians, those electricians, those carpenters can put kai on their tables.
Juanita Cotter from Rangiahua Marae says they received $50,000 in funding in order to restore the amo, or sides of the marae that hold up the front of the meeting house. She says they're also doing up the heke, or rafters of the marae, and the tukutuku panels inside the whare, which haven't been done up for over 40 years.
I'm really rapt that all the marae, but us, we got this fund because otherwise we wouldn't be able to do it. So we depend on funding like this to do jobs, especially these big jobs, and I was rapt. I'm so rapt that all the marae have this opportunity.
Miriama Hammond from Te Reinga, Pūtahi, Takitimu and Taihoa Marae say she hopes it will attract more rangatahi back to the marae.
I think it's going to be exciting for our marae, and it's going to be helpful to bring back maybe our young ones so that, they can become involved in the marae.
Ngāti Kahungunu ki Wairoa General Manager Sarah Paku says some of the marae are in a state of disrepair with leaky roofs and electrical systems that are so old they need to be completely redone. She says getting this repair work done will be huge for her people.
Our marae are our centre of our universe. So if they're strong, if they're dry, if they're serviceable, it's going to be great for our people.
The funding for the marae renovations comes from a $70 million fund earmarked in May, used to do up public spaces like marae, town halls and Pacifica churches. Mo te hōtaka o te ahiahi nei, ko Miriana Johnson tēnei.
3 of the country's youngest politicians believe they're making a real impact in their communities. It's been almost a year since the 3 were elected in local body elections, and it hasn't exactly been smooth sailing. 2 of them say they've encountered bigoted views. The trio, who are all 19 years old, spoke to Alicia Foon.
Rotorua councillor Fisher Wang admits it's been an uphill battle stepping into the political ring as a young man of Asian descent. He says while he finds the work rewarding, there have been some disheartening days.
It ranges from, telling me to go back to my own country when I'm born right here in Rotorua. My family immigrated over here over 20 years ago. Some of them that tell me that I'm just a little boy, that I don't know anything about our community or I don't know anything about politics. Why am I in this position to make decisions? So again, it's not just racist, so it's also ageist as well.
Nelson City Councillor Rohan O'Neill-Stevens says despite feeling like he has to prove himself, his colleagues do take him seriously.
I've had a couple of experiences where you'll more be mistaken for someone's child as opposed to their colleague. But on the whole, I'd say that actually, in many ways, I'm one of the more listened to. I think there's cultural zeitgeist of recognising the importance of youth perspective and a youth voice.
Kapiti councillor Sophie Handford says fortunately she hasn't faced those same barriers. Instead, they've been mainly in her head. She says it's been a privilege to be a pioneer within local politics, and age is just a number.
I really hope that we're continuing to break some ground and open up doors, and I think it's important for us to recognise too that when we're opening doors, we've got to continue to hold them open to make sure that there are young people that follow us, so it hasn't just been kind of this youth quake that we saw last year, but it'll be something that continues this year into the central government elections, but also to the next local government elections.
All 3 councillors are making efforts to mitigate the impacts of climate change and are focused on improving infrastructure and waterways. Ms Handford says introducing tikanga into council and honouring Te Tiriti o Waitangi is a priority.
I now make sure that every meeting the council blessing is being read out in Te Reo Māori by a different councillor to make sure that the councillors are giving that a go. Climate and resilience is now one of the core principles of our COVID recovery. Now on the policy work program is a climate change strategy, which we didn't have, so I'll be working in with staff around the development of that strategy.
Former Christchurch Mayor Vicky Buck was elected as a councillor in 1975, also aged 19, and says young voices are crucial, especially in the lead up to the general election.
I would like to see younger people even than 18, because I originally stood when I was 18 and then got in a by-election after one of the councillors died at 19. I've never thought that there is an age disparity in your ability to work in politics at all. I mean, how could that be? I mean, the decisions that you're making are going to have most impact on the youngest people.
Meanwhile, the young councillors say they're committed to trying to make local politics more accessible by using social media to reach the juvenile audience. Councillor Johan O'Neill-Stevens says the youth quake has made an impact.
On that high level of youth engagement is really just the message that increasingly young voices, diverse voices are being valued and are really needed if we want our decision making to be effective and to deliver the right outcomes for our communities.
Councillor Fisher Wang says the more diverse representation in politics is causing more and more young people to switch onto it. He's hoping for a strong turnout of young voters at the general election.
even though we're young, we will push forward. We won't be corrupted. We won't be compromised. We won't be like sheep and just simply follow whoever. We vote for what's best for our community. As you can see, I think, from the pandemic across the world, a lot of the countries that are doing fairly well are led by younger leaders, or they're led by female leaders.
And there is hope. Back in 2017, there was a slightly higher turnout of 18 to 24-year-olds than 25 to 29-year-olds, at 69% compared to 67%. And these young councillors are hoping their involvement will inspire that other 31% to get out and vote. For Checkpoint, ko Elisha Fern tēnei.
Pole vaulter Eliza McCartney has gone high-tech in an effort to keep persistent injuries at bay and enable her to get ready for next year's Olympics. McCartney has been troubled with an Achilles issue for a number of years. In the last 6 months, she's been wearing data-gathering bands on her ankles to determine the workload she's putting on her limbs. She told sports reporter Barry Guy she's been vaulting again recently, and it's done wonders for her confidence.
That was really exciting because it was just the first time I felt like I was really back in good shape again and able to vault well, and well enough to go over bungees and just feel like my technique was actually really good and I was getting back into things. So that was a nice, really, really nice step. I just was so adrenalised by that, and just it makes you so confident. So that was a really nice moment. But the last month I've been a bit quieter again. So I did just have a little rise of my Achilles symptoms, so just keeping on top of that.
Because of this, you're then going to have these down times to, just cope with it. Is that correct?
I might have to manage things differently in the future and maybe train a little bit smarter and just make sure that I don't put myself in risky periods where I could get return of Achilles symptoms. So we are looking at ways to kind of train a bit smarter and adjust training, but it is pretty early days and it will be evolving for quite a long time, I'm sure. But yeah, so it's just about being careful. I seem to be more prone to getting quite big responses to injuries because of some of the processes that seem to be going on in my body. So we just need to be aware of that and make sure that I'm not in a position where I could risk things turning up again.
It sounds like, and you've always sounded like this, that you're in a good space mentally, but everyone's going to be talking about the Olympics next year. Do you think about that?
I guess because it's so far away at the moment, a whole year, it's not too daunting to think about. And the season, our season in summer, is still feeling like it's quite far away as well. So at the moment, no, I'm really comfortable with where I'm at, and that's so much time to be able to be back in peak position in our season. So I'm just focusing on our season really at the moment, and that's the way I always approach it. It's about achieving the first thing first, and the first thing is to start competing in the summer and qualify, because that's the most important thing. And that's all really that weighs on my mind. And until that's done, I won't focus on much else beyond that.
Eliza McCartney talking to sports reporter Barry Guy. Cancer survivor and World Cup winner, the curtain will fall on Aaron Cruden's time in New Zealand rugby this weekend. The former All Black ran out for his 100th and last game for the Chiefs last weekend and will watch his beloved team from the stands in Wellington tomorrow night before heading to Japan to join the Kobe club. Rugby reporter Joe Porter has more.
Aaron Cruden played his 100th game for the Chiefs last weekend in Hamilton, and his teammates marked the milestone with an emotional haka. The former All Black of Ngāti Tūwharetoa never thought he would make it this far.
When I look back at it now, I feel very fortunate and privileged to have played professional rugby for as long as I have. In a contact sport like this, things can change and can be taken away from you pretty quickly. So, representing the All Blacks, obviously, a childhood dream, which was amazing. And now being able to bring up 100 Super Rugby games for one franchise team I'm very passionate about, certainly very proud.
Cruden was diagnosed with testicular cancer that had spread to his lungs in 2008. At 19 years old, he should have been playing his first season for Manawatu, but instead spent 9 weeks in and out of hospital having the testicle removed and then chemotherapy. Each rugby game since then, he's written his patient number on his wrist tape.
When you're that age, you sort of think you're a little bit invincible, you think you're a bit of a Superman, so to be rocked with something like that so early on, I think it probably gives you a little bit of mental resilience, a little bit of toughness in dark times, and knowing that whatever I'm faced with, I'm sure I'll be able to get through.
Cruden started Super Rugby with the Hurricanes in 2010 and made his All Blacks debut the same year. He would play a vital role in the All Blacks 2011 World Cup triumph after being called into the squad as an injury replacement for Dan Carter.
Still there for the All Blacks, and they're going to try a three-pointer from Cruden. Oh, looks good. He's got it. It's over.
Cruden dropped a goal in the semi-final win over the Wallabies and would start the final against France before going off injured late in the first half. A World Cup winner, Cruden would leave the Hurricanes to follow Manawatu coach Dave Rennie to the Chiefs in 2012.
My first Chiefs game, I remember actually getting charged down by Jason Rutledge against the Highlanders. They scored and then we lost.
However, the shift north would prove inspired, with Cruden overcoming the early hiccup to guide the Chiefs to back-to-back titles.
There was a bit of unknown at that time, a new coach coming in. There are a lot of new players into the franchise. So looking back on that year, 2012 especially, to be a part of it, to be a young 10 was pretty cool. And I think those seasons set me up pretty well to have the career that I've been able to have.
Though it hasn't all been glory, with Cruden involved in a couple of off-field incidents that threatened to derail his career. In 2014, he went out drinking and missed the All Blacks flight to Argentina, resulting in his suspension from the side.
A bit of a rude awakening, to be fair, something I look back on that I'm not very proud of in terms of how I conducted myself. But yeah, you are held in a certain regard, and you've got to sort of uphold those through your actions and the way you hold yourself. So yeah, obviously not my fondest moment.
Cruden left the Chiefs for France in 2017 but returned this year for one last hurrah. The Hamilton-based side have lost 7 straight games in Super Rugby Aotearoa, and while Cruden isn't in the matchday 23 for their season-ending clash with the Hurricanes, he's desperate to experience that winning feeling with his Chiefs teammates one last time. Mō te hōtaka o te ahi pōnei, ko Joe Porter aho.
Before we go on the subject of unlimited sick leave for people working at our borders and in isolation and quarantine facilities, overwhelmingly you all support the proposal, it would seem. This one in says, how many young children with symptoms are being sent to childcare right now because their parents have run out of sick leave? The same goes with school children. Teachers are being exposed daily to risk. What about the at-risk teachers? Another one says it should be for all New Zealanders, not just border workers. Have a wonderful weekend. Back on Monday.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. A judge has ruled that social entrapment and preconditions of alcohol and violence helped to create the conditions in which Karen Ann Riddell stabbed and killed her partner. In an emotional address, Oranga Tamariki's chief social worker has told the Waitangi Tribunal he understands the ministry needs to do better to support whānau Māori. Protesters in Beirut have been fired at with tear gas as they attempted to storm Parliament in anger over Tuesday's explosion. And a Wellington business owner has been fined $10,000 for illegally buying thousands of shellfish. Those are the headlines. Our next news will be at 7 o'clock.
Take the pulse of the day's news every weeknight at 10.
People talk about the stolen generation in Australia of Aboriginal children. The Indigenous children in this country have been stolen from their parents for just as many years.
Live with local, national and international stories as they happen.
With employment,